למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט.
You are listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.
Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon with Hebrew Voices, and this week I am truly humbled to bring you a living legend in the Jewish world, Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twerski, M.D. Rabbi Twerski's stature in the Jewish world is roughly equivalent to that of Billy Graham in the Christian world. He started out as a Hasidic pulpit rabbi, but then became a medical doctor and eventually a world-class psychiatrist. Rabbi Twerski is a tzaddik. He's a truly righteous man with a profound connection to God, who I think we can all look to and learn from. And that's certainly not something I say lightly about anyone, especially coming from my perspective. Rabbi Twerski has written over 70 books on a variety of topics, and I read 2 of his books in preparation for this episode. One called Self-Improvement, I'm Jewish, and the other called The Spiritual Self. Now, throughout this interview, Rabbi Twerski speaks about the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I want to make something very clear. This is not an episode about alcoholism. Rabbi Twerski emphasizes in his books that the 12 steps are an authentic Jewish path to cultivating true spirituality. He describes the 12 steps as a practical way of integrating certain aspects of the Torah into your life, and calls this the, quote, antidote to Satan. So why are the 12 steps so closely associated with alcoholism? Rabbi Twerski explains that in a way, alcoholics have an easier time developing a spiritual connection to God. If you're not an addict, you might be able to get away with living your whole life without having a relationship with God. In contrast, hardcore alcoholics and drug addicts don't have that luxury. They'll end up dead or in prison if they don't use the 12 steps to defeat Satan and cultivate that spirituality. And true spirituality is not about blissfully raking a rock garden. It's about getting out of your comfort zone through self-examination in order to maximize your potential with God's help. I thought this would be a great topic for a Passover special, providing a practical step-by-step plan for cleaning the spiritual leaven out of our lives and leading us from bondage to freedom. As I was preparing this program, I learned that Rabbi Twerski, in addition to all of his other accomplishments, is the author of the standard Jewish tune for chanting Psalms 28:9. This tune is sung in Jewish prayer services throughout the world. I asked Rabbi Twerski about this, and he started out our conversation by singing the verse for us. I just can't emphasize what a big deal this is for me growing up in the synagogue, hearing this song every week, now hearing it from the author of the tune. So here is Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twerski singing the words of the psalmist, Hoshia et amecha, uvarech et nachalatecha, ure'em v'nasaem ad ha'olam. Save your people and bless your inheritance. Be their shepherd and bear them on your shoulders forever.
Hoshia et amecha, uvarech et nachalatecha.
I'm standing here with my arms like going along with it and all excited. Rabbi, when I read that you came up with that tune, I said that can't be. That's like saying that you're the man who invented peanut butter and jelly. Like, that's always been around. Nobody invented peanut butter and jelly. But so how did you come up with that tune, Rabbi?
Well, you don't. You may be able to invent peanut butter and jelly, but you don't invent tunes.
So how did that come to you?
How did it come to you? Just like any idea comes to you. I happen to believe that it's that it's an inspiration. I remember exactly where I was in 1960. It was the week before my younger brother's wedding, and I was davening, and I came to the phrase Hoshia Samecha, and I started singing it. I had never heard it. Obviously, I had never heard it before, right? And so a week later, at my brother's wedding, we sang the tune, and it was very catchy. And somebody took the tune then to Israel. And when it came back from Israel to America, it was a Bratzover niggin or a Chabad niggin or whatever.
And niggin is a tune for those who don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but I happen to know that again, I didn't invent that. You don't invent those things. There was a tune that was put into my mind by Hashem.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I'm very glad that I had the zechus that people are besimcha and can dance to my song.
Okay, and roughly in English, you said, I'm happy. I have the blessing that people are I guess happy and can dance to the song. So have the joy. And really, I mentioned to my brother-in-law here in Jerusalem that I'll be interviewing you, and he went over to his bookshelf. This was a Shabbat afternoon dinner, And he pulled off 3 books from his bookshelf that you wrote. And one was about, how to raise children or something. And you've written over 70 books. It's incredible. What I wanted to talk to you about today is really this, this is going to be a Pesach special, a Passover special. And I heard this wonderful teaching you did on this idea of going from bondage to freedom. And I just found out you have a Passover Haggadah that you put together on this very topic. And I guess you're talking about going from bondage to freedom, am I right, through the 12 steps? Right. And just to be clear, when you talk about the 12 steps, one of the things you say in your book is they're not just for alcoholics. You mention in your book that they're actually basically for everybody, for anybody who has a defective character, which that's everybody. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Nehemia. Yes, everybody, because the only being that's perfect is Hashem. Every other creature has defects.
So basically, these 12 steps aren't for alcoholics. And I know there's some people listening like, oh, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm turning this off. And really what this is about dealing with character defects and going from bondage to various things to freedom. So can you talk a little bit about that, Rabbi?
Okay, so let me tell you how I got started on it.
Yeah.
Right? There was a young man who came to my institute in Pittsburgh 31 years ago. His father was a scholar, a rabbi, and this young man had gotten involved in drugs. And he came to Pittsburgh, and Baruch Hashem, the program succeeded, and he is now 31 years sober. But I knew at that time that I could not let him return to New York because if he gets in touch with his friends, he'll be right back on drugs. So I had him stay in Pittsburgh for several months, and then one day he told me that he wants to go to his father's Seder. I said, of course. So he went to his father's Seder, and after Pesach, he came back to Pittsburgh, and he said, when my father started saying the Haggadah for Passover, and he started saying, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves. I interrupted it and I said, Abba, Daddy, right? Can you ever say about yourself that you were personally a slave? You're talking about your ancestors 3,000 of years ago, but you don't know personally what it means to be a slave. I can tell you what it means to be a slave, because all those years that I was on drugs, I was not a free person. I did things that I never thought I was capable of doing, but I had to do them to get drugs. Right. When he told me that, I suddenly realized I had an answer to a question, because we talk about in our prayers and in our services, we talk about the deliverance from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, our deliverance from Egypt, our deliverance from slavery. Right? And we say that so many times. Almost every mitzvah, almost everything that we do that has to do with our faith is somehow related to the Yetziat Mitzrayim, to the deliverance from Egypt. And I was wondering, why? I mean, it's important, but why is it that important? And when this young man told me that what he did about interrupting his father in the Haggadah, I realized the deliverance from Egypt is not restricted to being a slave to Pharaoh or to being a slave to Stalin or to being a slave to any person. Right? It is being a slave in the sense that you're not free to be what you should be. Right?
So this is bondage from essentially slavery of not being anything where you're fulfilling your potential or, being what you should be.
Right. Look, you can be a slave to alcohol. You can be a slave to heroin. You can be a slave to cocaine. You can be a slave to sex. You can be a slave to food. You can be a slave to anger. You can be a slave to money making. Once you lose control of something, right? And so many things become addictive, right? Once you lose control of something, you're a slave. Mm-hmm. Right?
And I read in one of the books where you talked about this is, even people who suffer from procrastination, this is a way of dealing with it. I mean,
right,
which is, this is a broad application. Can I read a quote that you actually gave a lecture that I was listening to, and I wrote this down. You said, even though I'd never drank, I used the 12-step program every day. I go to meetings because the 12 steps has taught me something about character formation, that my job is to be the best human being I can be. And the only way to do that is to get rid of the defects that human beings have, and I've got them. And so I found AA to be a program that can help people overcome their character defects. Then you say, I really think that Bill Wilson plagiarized the works of Jewish ethics and of Musser.
Right.
For those who don't know, Bill Wilson was the founder of the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you're saying that and this was something, I read the big book of AA, and as I'm reading it, I hear this, and they're talking about, and he's using terminology, I guess, that his people are familiar with. He talks about how God did for me what I couldn't do for myself. And I read that and I said, what kind of, this rabbi saying this is Jewish? What do you mean God did for me? What Judaism is about stand up and be a man. In Deuteronomy 30, verse 15, I placed before you today life and good and death and evil, choose life. And Bill Wilson is writing in the big book of AA in the 12 steps, God did for me what I couldn't do. So explain that, Rabbi. How do you say this is a Jewish thing taken?
How do we reconcile it? Right. Well, the Talmud says that a person's yetzer hara, a person's evil instinct. By the evil instinct, it means a person's biological instinct. Now, we are all born biologically, right? Tigers are born with a biological instinct. Elephants are born with a biological instinct. The difference is that a tiger cannot choose what to do. He does what its instincts force him to tell him to do. Now, when the tiger kills a gazelle for food, it is not a crime. Right? What the tiger is doing is what nature designed for him to do, how to get his nourishment. Right? If a human being murders, that's a terrible crime.
Right.
Because a human being is not supposed to give in to his instincts. A human being is supposed to be in control of oneself and not to be a pawn and a helpless automaton that cannot. So now, what makes the difference between them? And that is that the human being was given by God, was given a potential to make himself different than animals. And that potential is what we refer to as the spirit.
Okay.
Right? Now, I don't know what the soul is. I don't know that anybody knows what the soul is. But I can tell you what the spirit is.
Okay.
The spirit consists of all of the traits that are unique to a human being that an animal does not have.
Okay.
So the human being can learn from the past history, which an animal cannot do. The human being can choose between right and wrong. The human being can delay the gratification. The human being can have a concept of what is my life for and work toward an ultimate purpose. Right. So there are many things, about 12 or 13 traits that I listed in one of my books, but the unique things that are characteristic of a human being that separate one from animals, right? Now, science made a mistake in saying that a human being is a Homo sapiens, right? Now, Homo sapiens is a Latin term, but what it really means in plain English is a baboon with intellect, right? And Homo is the hominoids, the gorillas, the apes, the baboons, and sapiens is knowledge, right? I refuse to consider myself a knowledgeable baboon, right?
In other words, you're more than that. And I got to say, Rabbi, I was a few months ago. I was in the U.S. and I was in a Walmart, and I'm looking around as I'm waiting in Walmart in line, and the people are going through the self checkout, and I stopped for a minute. And I thought, so they really want us to believe these are a bunch of really smart apes that created Walmart and then self checkout, and I just can't believe that. I mean, I just don't believe that. And this is before I read your books. And I thought that exact thing. Like, I mean, here are these human beings. I mean, we're so much more than that, and it's degrading to us to say we're a bunch of smart monkeys. I mean, smart apes.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I have the good fortune of having been born in 1930. And I remember
Wait,
the years...
stop, Rabbi. How old are you right now?
Right, 85.
You're 85. I'm humble.
85.
I'm wow. Okay, go on. You were born in 1930, yeah?
So, if you the years in the 1930s, right, life was full of difficulties. Life was full of hardships. The average life expectancy in the United States was under 50. Right? Tuberculosis killed people. Pneumonia killed people. There were no antibiotics. Right? There was no relief from the sweltering heat because there was no air conditioning.
Yeah.
Travel was difficult and dangerous. Right? I went from Milwaukee to Los Angeles 60 hours by train.
60 hours? Wow.
2 days and 3 nights.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
There were no microwaves.
I don't believe that, Rabbi. No, I'm just kidding. Go on.
Right. Now, when I sit in my comfortable car and turn on the air conditioning and all the other gadgets, I remember my first car, which was a 1936 Plymouth, right?
Okay.
But what I'm saying is, because of all the difficulties that there were, our house had signs on it for quarantined 6 different times. Wow. Because each time I had one of the childhood diseases, whooping cough, scarlet fever, measles, mumps, right? There was no immunization. So, and work, there was no electronics. Work was physically hard. Right? In the 1930s, there was so much misery to life that no one in their right mind could have thought the purpose of life is to have pleasure. The purpose of life is to have all the fun you can. The world is a great big amusement park. Nobody could believe that. So what happens now, all of the wonderful things that science and technology has given us, including the ability for me to sit here and talk with you in Israel.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? Can you even believe it? I'm talking with you and you're the other side of the world. It's incredible.
And in the 1940s, to get from America to Israel would have been 6 weeks by boat, right? Right? And now it's 10 hours. So what has happened is that science and technology and medicine have taken away so much of the suffering that we had then, that now many people believe the goal in life is to get as much fun as you can, get all the pleasure that you can. And the downside of that is that when people, especially youngsters, right, feel, hey, I'm not getting my share of fun, I'm not getting my share of pleasure, right? What they do is they go for something that's guaranteed to give them a high, right? And so they go for drugs, right? And that's why the drug, we've spent billions and billions of dollars to try and prevent drug addiction. And I've said one time that we will never be able to solve the drug problem until we can have a good answer to a question raised by a young woman. When Nancy Reagan launched the program, Just Say No to Drugs, they asked some young people, what do you think of this program about Just Say No to Drugs? And a 14-year-old girl says, why? What else is there?
Wow. That's a sad commentary on,
Right.
So basically you're saying we've been taught in the modern Western world that the purpose of life is pleasure. I was talking to this Christian woman a few years back, and she was telling me, and she's coming from a very different perspective than me, but she was telling me that anything that doesn't bring joy is not from God. And here I am, a Jew. I hear this and I'm thinking about, okay, I'm thinking about what are you talking about? We've got in Judaism, first thing that comes to mind is Yom Kippur. I don't enjoy fasting on Yom Kippur. We've got, and that really struck me, very different approach than what I'm used to in coming from my culture. And you had this whole discussion in one of your books where you talk about how there's this contrast between comfort and spirituality. And boy, is that something different than what we've heard. What we've heard is spirituality is where you sit in very calm with, water flowing sounds and you're meditating. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. But that's what spirituality is about. And you say, no, spirituality is the opposite of comfort. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think a very good example of that is I tell people walk down the aisle of the supermarket where they have the evaporated and condensed milk.
I love this. Yeah.
And look at the can of carnation milk, and it says milk from contented cows.
Yeah.
Now, why should I care whether a cow is contented or not? Right? Clearly, the producer wants me to buy his product because he got superior milk, because his cows are the most excellent. Well, what makes his cows more excellent? They are contented. So the excellence of a cow is to be contented. If all I go by and if all I strive for in life is contentment, then I share a goal in life with a cow, and I'm just too proud to have that.
So you're saying spirituality actually is the opposite in some sense of contentment, because you're challenging yourself by challenging yourself to have purpose. I want to read a quote from your book, The Spiritual Self, Reflections on Recovery and God, which I got on my Kindle. It says, you wrote here, I am willing to pay the price of turbulence rather than have bovine tranquility.
Exactly.
Wow, that's profound, Rabbi.
Exactly.
And then you wrote later a few pages later, you wrote, our physical desire is for comfort and tranquility, and satisfying this desire is certain to be frustrated when one searches for purpose in life. And what you're saying there is one of the core aspects of being spiritual is that you find a purpose in life. You don't define for everybody what that is, but searching for that purpose is going to bring you out of your comfort zone. And if you're looking for contentment and tranquility, well, that's the opposite of spirituality. That's unbelievable, Rabbi. That's so contrary to the message that has been preached to us. And I want to remind people, Rabbi, you are a trained psychiatrist, a medical doctor, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, you are the founder and medical director emeritus of the Gateway Rehabilitation Center, which is a world-renowned rehab center. So when you say these things, I think we have to listen to what you're saying and take it seriously. This is some profound, deep stuff. I mean, wow.
No, I talk about a goal in life.
Yeah.
And it's what spirituality is all about. Spirituality is working toward becoming the best person you can become. Animals don't do that. I don't believe that any tiger or alligator has said, what do I have to do to be a better alligator than I am? Right? The human being has the capacity to think about that and to make the efforts to do that and to rid oneself of those kinds of things that stand in the way. And by the way, I came across a quote from Professor Albert Einstein who says, have a goal in life of comfort and pleasure is appropriate for a herd of swine. Right?
Wow.
Not for a human being.
Wow. It's just so contrary to everything that we've been told by Western society, that the purpose is, to be peaceful and tranquil. And you're saying that's great for a cow. It's not great for a human being. And
Right.
you're saying this both as a rabbi who, and I didn't mention this, but you are a rabbi from a long line, not just of rabbis, but of rebbes, of Hasidic rebbes, of, I don't even know how to translate that into English. Maybe you can explain what it is. And so why did you decide to go into psychiatry? You share in some of your books about this. Can you tell people, you were a rabbi, a pulpit rabbi, and your father was. Why psychiatry?
Right. Well, what happened was that I began first of all, I never wanted to be a rabbi because I saw that I could not become the kind of rabbi that my father was. My father never cracked a psychology book, right? But he was an intuitive psychologist, an intuitive therapist, and his office was buzzing day and night with people who came to him for help and guidance.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
When I became a rabbi in 1951, this was after World War II, and at that point, psychology and psychiatry had a meteoric rise. And it became evident to me that this is a different world than my father had, because people are not going to go to the rabbi for guidance. People are going to go to the psychiatrist. Well, then what am I going to do? Well, what I'm going to do as a rabbi, I'm going to officiate at weddings and at funerals and at monuments unveilings and at bar mitzvahs and all kinds of ceremonials. And
which are important things, but that's not what you felt called to do.
Yeah, but that could not be my goal in life.
Okay. Wow.
So I decided then to become a psychiatrist. And then a lot of things happened. Things happen that you're destined to happen by providence. And I was asked to take over the position in 1965 of director of psychiatry at St. Francis Hospital in Pittsburgh. And it had a large 300-bed unit of psychiatry, neurology and psychiatry. And so I did.
And can I just, I'm sorry to interject. I just want to set the scene for people. You tell this great story about how you grew up as what I think in Israel we'd call a Haredi, an ultra-Orthodox Jew. I don't know if you'd agree with that term. But you tell the story of how you once played chess on Rosh Hashanah, and basically your father rebuked you from that. So you're going from that to you're running a 300-bed psychiatric unit in Pittsburgh. That's not that's not right. The script that people would expect for you.
Right. Well, then what happened? Of course, I guess I was guided to be there, and part of the 300-bed unit was a 30-bed unit for detoxing alcoholics.
Okay.
Right. And what happened was these people would come in drunk and they would stay for 3 or 4 days. We would tell them to go to an AA meeting, which most of them never did. And then 2 months they'd be back and we had a revolving door. So I said to the nun, Sister Adele, who was our administrator, and by the way, there's a book called The Rabbi and the Nuns.
I can't wait to read that book, Rabbi. I haven't read it. So share about that. Share about your conversation with. So here you are, this Hasidic rabbi who's a psychiatrist, and you're dealing with the nuns. It's right. Unbelievable. I love it.
Right. It's an interesting book because there were interesting things. There's a story going around about my contact tangentially with the Pope, but that's an interesting story. If
you wait. Let's stop. If you won't tell the story, can you tell the story and very briefly the story with the Pope?
Yeah, what happened was that there was a 34-year-old young priest who was admitted who was an alcoholic, and unfortunately, he went into the delirium tremens, a withdrawal reaction, which is a very serious condition. 15% of people with delirium tremens do not survive.
Wow!
And he was in intensive care for 3 days. His heart rate did not go below 200 beats a minute for 3 days.
Wow.
He was anointed. He was given the last rites. The day he was discharged from the intensive care unit, I went to see him, and the nurse says, "Doctor, do you know that Father has asked for Cipical mouthwash 3 times today?" I said, "You're kidding. Cipical mouthwash has alcohol."
Oh, he's trying to get alcohol by any means, is what you're telling us. Okay.
So I went over to him and I said, "Father, are you crazy? Do you realize that you were anointed? We thought you were going to die, and after 3 days of being close to death due to alcohol, you're drinking alcohol mouthwash?" And he said, "I would never do that." I said, "Don't tell me that. We're going to get a technician up here and do a blood level on you."
Oh.
So he admitted that he was drinking alcohol.
Oh, wow.
Mouthwash. So I said, "Look, if after 3 days of being close to death, you can go back to drinking alcohol, you have no control whatever. You have to take Antabuse." He says, "What's that?" "It's a medication that prevents you from drinking, because if you take Antabuse every day and you take as much as a single drop of alcohol, you'll become deathly sick. So you won't drink." He says, "Well, how can I say the Mass?" I said, "Why?"
The Catholic
"You have
Mass,
to take a sip of wine." I said, "Oh, don't use wine. Use grape juice."
A great Hasidic answer.
Right? So he says, "We can't do that. It has to be wine." Now, during my stay in Pittsburgh, I became a close friend of Cardinal John Wright, who was then moved to the Vatican and became number 3 man in the hierarchy of the church. So I went down to my office and I called Rome, and I called Cardinal Wright. I said, Cardinal Wright, I've got a young priest. If he's not allowed to use grape juice for the Mass, he's going to die from alcoholism. Please go to the Pope and get me a dispensation. Right?
The Hasidic rabbi is getting a hat or a special dispensation from the Pope for this priest. Unbelievable.
No, he said, Rabbi, I will personally carry it to the Holy Father.
Wow.
Well, the next day, that time was Pope Paul VI. The next day, Cardinal Wright called me. He says, Rabbi, we now have a dispensation. Any alcoholic priest can use grape juice.
That's amazing.
I said, thank you. Go tell the Pope he had a mitzvah.
That's great. The Pope had a mitzvah. I love the story. So, Rabbi, I want to go back really briefly to this issue of choice. And you talk in your book about Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15. God places before us the choice between good and evil. We're supposed to choose good that we live. And then the alcoholic concept, or I say the 12-step concept there, is that when how does that go? I'm really bad with this stuff. My life is unmanageable and I can't control this.
Right.
So how do you reconcile like that specific point of choice? So does and other people who are listening to this might say, well, my issue isn't alcohol. My issue is rage, or my issue is, like you mentioned, procrastination. And so am I powerless over procrastination? So
the Talmud says it very simply. God said, look, I gave you the Torah, right? And I also created a Satan that's an evil force to try and deviate you from becoming what you're supposed to be, right? Now, there's an antidote to Satan, and that is observing the Torah and understanding it properly and serving God with one's full heart. And essentially, it means getting out of your own skin and being helpful to other people, right? So, do people have a choice? Yes. But the only way they can implement that choice is by asking for divine assistance.
So I want to make this really clear. Rabbi, you are saying that according to the Jewish approach, a person cannot really keep all the commandments of the Torah perfectly without God's help, is basically
exactly.
What you're saying. And what comes to mind is, I think it's Jeremiah, who says, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, return us to you and we will return, meaning like there's a certain amount where we need God's help. And you have to do, and I think the way you describe it in your book is we have to do our utmost and then trust God to help us with the rest. Is that kind of how you look at it?
Do whatever is within your power to do. When you've reached the point where there's nothing more that you can do, you ask for divine inspiration, for divine help, and you'll get it.
Wow. And that's kind of what the Serenity Prayer, which is in the AA and in the 12-step tradition, where they ask God, there's things I can change, things I can't change, and God help me know what I can do and what I can't. That's right. That's profound. You quote this one verse, and my listeners like to hear Bible verses, so I'm going to quote this. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 29. And it says, this is some translation. It says, "See, this alone I found, that God made human beings straightforward, but they have devised many schemes." And you have an explanation of that in your books. Can you talk about that? How basically God made us simple, and we've messed it up by our thoughts. Yeah.
And that's where I think AA got the idea from. Keep it simple. Right? And what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes is, if you kept things simple, you could live a very happy, a good, productive life. The problem is that you have manipulations and you have rationalizations, and you give yourself all kinds of excuses to do what your desires to fulfill your desires. So one alcoholic who was sober a number of years said, doctor, in all of my years of drinking, I never took a single drink unless I thought it was the right thing to do at the time.
So he convinced himself this was a good idea.
Right. So what happens is we have this power to delude ourselves. And that's if you fool somebody else, well, maybe you've cheated something that's a ethical misdeed. But if you deceive yourself, you're helpless. Right? That's stupid to deceive yourself. It may be criminal to deceive others. It's simply stupidity to deceive yourself.
Wow.
So what we have to do is realize that there are things that are right, things that are wrong. Many of the things that are wrong are some of our animalistic desires, which we have to subdue and learn to control.
Okay. Now, you talk about in your books how you had this, and you mentioned the nuns, and that you had this interaction with the nuns about about they have this concept of original sin, and then as coming from a Jewish perspective, that you had a really different take on that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I said, look, I agree to the concept of original sin, but I think that original sin is deceiving yourself and not realizing the potential good within yourself and what you can accomplish for yourself and for humanity. That's the worst sin of all, right?
Okay, and then the Catholic concept is, and I'm not an expert on Catholicism, but basically that you're born bad. Is that kind of how it?
Right. I don't think that anybody's born bad. I think a person is born with the potential of being bad, but he makes the choice.
Now, in your books, you talk about, and I love this, you talk about what the Torah approach has in common with 12 steps, and you contrast that to psychoanalysis. And you're a psychiatrist. And can you talk a little bit about that, how you found that the 12 steps lines up more with Torah than the psychoanalysis does?
Well, I think that Freud, of course, was, Freud, first of all, Freud was a very brilliant psychologist, right? And he had tremendous insights. And one of the insights that he had later in life, his disciples disagreed with him. They thought they felt that he was depressed, which he was, and it's because of his depression that he thought this. Freud came up with the idea that there are two forces in a person, right? One is called eros, right, which is love and constructive and productive, and the other is thanatos, which is death and destruction. And Freud said, in every person, without exception, in every human being, there is a death wish, a self-destructive drive. Right? Now, his disciple says, look, that's just not true. Freud says, look, I can't understand why this is so. Because Freud was an atheist and did not believe that that there was a God, and that God did anything. He couldn't make heads or tails of it. He says, I can't understand why it's there, but I can't deny that it's there. Right.
And it's contrary to Freud's evolutionary approach that we shouldn't have a death wish. Our wish should be to reproduce ourselves.
Right.
So and then I think you tie that to the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, the good inclination and the evil inclination, and you bring this great example of how you tell this great story of how people would come to psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, whatever it's called, and they try to figure out why they're drinking alcohol, but they keep drinking. And the 12 steps says, first put down the bottle. And you tie that to Na'aseh v'nishma, Exodus 24:7, where can you talk about that, Rabbi?
Yeah, I think that the mistaken concept is a person drinks because of stress, because of depression, because of his job, because of his family, because none of that is true. All right, a person is a diabetic because he's a diabetic. That's the disease. Right now, you can conduct yourself properly to minimize the effects of the diabetes, right? But it's a disease that you're born with. I think that the same thing is true of alcoholism and of many other addictions, right? They are diseases, and you're not an alcoholic because of your wife, or you're an alcoholic because of your children, or an alcoholic because of your boss. You're an alcoholic because you're an alcoholic. Now, the thing that I found works most often and works best is accepting that, right? And realizing, let me find what people who are sober, what they've done to avoid the self-destruction. And that's where the AA meeting comes in. When you walk into a room with 40 people who are in recovery, you've got 40 people who are expert on how to stay sober. Right. Now, again, it's not only a question of alcohol. There's a guy by the name of Clancy, I don't know if he's still alive, out in California. I heard Clancy when he was celebrating his 50th anniversary of sobriety. And he says it so beautifully. He says, look, if your problem is alcohol, you don't need AA. Just stop drinking.
How'd that work?
My problem wasn't alcohol. My problem was alcoholism.
Oh, okay.
After I stopped drinking, I was left with the ism. He says, before I stopped drinking, I was arrested, put in jail 3 times. And after I stopped drinking, I was put in jail 7 times, right? Because I still had the ism. Yeah. And we have to realize that all of us have isms. And what the ism is really all about is total self-satisfaction, total egocentricity. The world was created for me to enjoy, and nothing should stand in my way. I just have to see that I shouldn't get caught and be put in prison for it. But otherwise, that's the ism.
And that's far beyond just issues of alcohol. And you say in your books that the 12 steps are for all self-defeating lifestyles and for all self-destructive behaviors.
Right.
Which is, that's pretty much kind of like a lot of that's what the Torah talks about. What I love about what you said in the book here, in this book, Self-Improvement, I'm Jewish, you talk about how, people would go into the meeting and the first thing they say is stop drinking. And then you'll figure out why. You'll do the steps and you'll find out maybe why you drink or maybe you won't. But first stop drinking. And then we have this thing in the Torah where, God presents the covenant to the people of Israel in Exodus 24:7. And they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we're going to do it. And then we'll hear what it is.
Right.
First there's action, and then you can figure out some of those.
Then you can sit right. Because if you go to a psychologist to help you stop drinking and you don't have the 12-step program, he can analyze you for 12 years, right?
And you're still drinking in the meantime.
And you're still drinking.
Whereas at the 12 steps, you walk in, and I guess the way it works is you got to stop.
Pick up the first drink and come to meetings.
Right. Wow. That's some really powerful stuff. Rabbi, I wanted to spend a whole bunch of time, which I don't think we're going to have, talking about issues of you have this great teaching where you talk about 3 different things, which are anger, rage, and resentment. And I was hoping that we would have time to do a whole discussion about getting the resentment out of our lives. And the metaphor I had of, like resentment is like chametz, it's like leaven, that it's in your life and it festers and it grows. And if you don't get rid of it, then it's gonna change you in a bad way. And I don't think we're gonna have time to talk about that, but maybe you'll come back and do another program with us, Rabbi.
Okay, look, just good to know that the best definition of resentment is swallowing poison and thinking it's going to kill the other person. Right? Resentments are poison, they're toxic, and we have to find ways of getting rid of them.
Right, and that is one of the things I think that the 12 steps, at least from what I read in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, kind of focuses on is, I think there's some phrase in there about resentment kills alcoholics, and there's a whole thing there about writing down your resentments and reading your resentments to another person, and that's some pretty fascinating stuff. And it's all, what it reminds me of a little bit, I'll just say really briefly, is in Catholicism they have this idea of where they go to confession and they confess all their issues to a priest. And in Judaism, and maybe in Hasidic Judaism it's different, but in the Judaism I grew up with, we don't have anything like that.
Right.
You'd never go tell your problems to a rabbi, at least again where I grew up. And here there's this system which you're saying is for everybody, not just alcoholics, where people can work through those issues and flush out. It's almost like doing a Pesach cleaning, where you're getting rid of, that resentment and you're left with a clean house. And I just love that image. It's some powerful stuff. Rabbi, I am so thankful for you, coming on our program. And you sang for us before Hoshea et Amecha, which is the verse from Psalms. And would you be willing to end this program with the serenity prayer?
God grant me the serenity to accept that which I cannot change, the courage to change that which I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Amen. Thank you very much, Rabbi. Shalom.
My pleasure. Shalom.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.